Well, brethren, I want to ask you the question, are we still the Lord's treasured people? Is God blessing America? Is God blessing Canada? You know, when we think of what's happening in the news just recently, we have Hurricane Harvey, you know, with this once in 1,000 years rainfall. What did this hurricane parked offshore for days and dumped something close to 4 feet full of rain on Houston? I had the opportunity of paying a bill to one of our courier companies, and their payment center is based in Houston, Texas. And I asked the woman who was getting my information a little bit of what it was like, and she really wanted to talk about it because it was an incredible experience. She bent my ear for a while, you know, with this, and she said, you know, I told her we would pray for her, and she said, boy, do we need those prayers. Thank you. Because it has been a difficult thing. They're saying that this is going to cost Houston, which is an enormous area, by the way. It is a major American metropolitan area. Something like number 8 or something in the United States. They say it's going to cost something upwards of about $150 billion. Now, some wags might say, oh, well, this is just going to add to the GDP, having to replace all these thousands of cars and houses and whatever, all this sorts of stuff. Well, losses to the insurance companies comes back and bites the people later in higher rates. And now to piggyback, as it were, on the back of Hurricane Harvey, you have Hurricane Irma. We already know what it's done to some of the lesser Antilles Islands, and it's barreling on to Florida and who knows where. Many years ago, when I was in public school, in high school and junior high school, I lived in Florida for some time. And I went through a number of hurricanes, but none of them are going to be quite like what this one is talking about. Now, we also have, you know, it's amazing, today's paper, there are 82 major fires burning in the western states of the U.S., and the wildfire smoke is blanketing, you know, much of the western and northwestern U.S. states. It's setting off health alarms, and we know that. They have a quote there from Brian Henry, assistant manager of the United States' National Interagency Fire Center. He commented, you know, the situation is so bad, it's a shame when it gets to the point where the high density of the smoke is literally so bad that it actually helps you. Helps you? Well, because the firefighters say that this heavy smoke in the atmosphere reduces the temperatures and adds humidity to the air, and thus calms some of the aggressive behavior of the fires, allowing the firefighters a few extra moments to try to get a handle on steering where these things go. They're not trying to put them out. They're trying to steer them where they go. And I can attest this past week exactly how that works, because here in Nanaimo, we've been getting all this smoke boiling up from Washington State. It was worse about 100 kilometers south of here, down in Victoria. It was worse, but it was bad enough here. We had health alerts, you know, bad air alerts, this sort of thing, all this past week. And we've had a couple weeks earlier in this summer and back in August, there were 2 weeks straight where we had this bad smoky air. And I know that we've recently we were alerted that there are some Sabbath keepers on a ranch in Montana, and you know, they're facing terrible times, you know, worried about getting burnt out, worrying about some of these things. A lot of the ranchers here, you know, their fences have all been burnt, and their cattle's feet. You know, the government is going to give them $20 million, which is probably just a drop in the bucket for what all the ranchers in the, you know, the center part here of BC and the interior of what they've lost. And even my son and my daughter-in-law this past summer, they faced 2 times. They've been under threat of evacuation because of the nature of the fires in the interior of the province of British Columbia. And of course, we want to ask this question too. You know, the ongoing threats of North Korea are still there. You know, should Americans be worried about it? You know, some people think, well, we don't really have to worry about it because the nukes couldn't really, they don't think that the North Koreans have everything perhaps miniaturized, or that they can protect their nuke from re-entering the atmosphere. But if you listen to what the North Koreans say, they're just talking about blowing up some of these things in the atmosphere above the United States, which would be like an electromagnetic pulse bomb. Fry all the electronics in a great part of the U.S. I don't know. Of course, you also have, of course, simmering all the time. We don't see it so much with all the threats from the jihadis and the terrorists. Is God still blessing the USA? Let's take a look here. Let's look at something. Perhaps we can look into the Bible. All this seems a little remote. How does this fit into the Bible? Let's take a look and see what the Bible says. That maybe we should pay attention to something to answer this question. How does God work? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. I'm going to read this in the Amplified Bible version. This is the Apostle Paul. Okay, and he's obviously writing to the church in Corinth, and he says, I do not want you to be unaware, believers, that is, unaware brethren. These are the Corinthian Greek brethren, okay? They're Greeks. They're not Jews. They're not Hebrews. They were Greeks, but he's saying, for I do not want you to be aware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers, our fathers, wait a minute, they're Greeks, and here he's going to talk. Our fathers were all under the cloud, and here he's making allusions to the children of Israel leaving Egypt, meaning very clearly that if you're in the church, all of a sudden the story of the Bible becomes your story. You are grafted into it. You've changed your destiny. You've changed who your people are, spiritually speaking. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud, in which God's presence went before them, and they all passed, in the Amplified notes, miraculously and safely, through the Red Sea. And all of them were baptized into Moses. Now, the Amplified says, into his safekeeping as their leader. But remember, when Moses made a covenant with ancient Israel, he was a mediator between the people and Yahweh, or the Lord, of the one who stood on top of Mount Sinai. Okay, Moses was the mediator of their covenant with God, the biblical God, and all of them were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all of them ate the same spiritual food. Okay, you could think of, manna, but what they were being taught. And all of them drank of the same spiritual drink. Because, of course, in the desert through the Sinai and the wilderness there, God had to miraculously provide them with water, the spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them. Then Paul makes a very bold statement. Who was the God that stood on top of Mount Sinai? The God who worked with Moses, who appeared at the burning bush, and the rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4. That's one of those scriptures that creates a lot of problem for some theologians who don't like to think about the fact that the God of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament God, was Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Verse 5, nevertheless, God was not well pleased with most of them. Okay, with most of these Israelites who he led out of Egypt, for they were scattered along the ground in the wilderness, and the Amplified notes, because of their lack of self-control, led to disobedience, and the disobedience led to death. As it says, God was not pleased with most of them, for they were scattered along the ground in the wilderness. Now he's going to make a statement. Why is this important? Oh, Corinthian Greek brethren, whose fathers, who you now should be considering these accounts in the Bible, your accounts of your spiritual inheritance, of your spiritual fathers. Now these things, these warnings and admonitions of all the story of what's in the Scriptures, what is written in the scriptures, in the books of that written by Moses, in the Torah, took place as examples for us. Oh, these are examples for us? New Covenant Christians? You bet they are, Paul is saying. They're examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they did. Okay, we're supposed to learn on their dime. We are, as Christians, we are supposed to learn on the ancient Israelites' dime. Do not be worshipers of idols, as some of them were. Just as it is written in the scripture, that people sat down to eat and drink. Okay, that's, of course, they sat down to eat and drink after they sacrificed to the golden calf there in Horeb and Mount Sinai, at the pressed foot of Mount Sinai, because you remember the story. Moses was still up. He spent 40 days talking with God and getting the 10 Commandments, and while he was gone, well, while the cat's away, the mice will play. They really will. I mean, that's just plain old human nature. The people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play, which is the Amplified Bible notes, indulging in immoral activities. Party, 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 party. You know what happens? A little bit too much booze, too much whatever, and woohoo, at the bar Friday night. That's what it was just like. We must not indulge in the Amplified notes, nor tolerate, because, of course, a little earlier in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul makes a big point in telling the congregation, you can't tolerate this person coming to church, sitting in there who has such a public, open example of sexual immorality. He was sleeping with his stepmother. We must not indulge nor tolerate, and that's right for the Amplified to put that in there, sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 suddenly fell dead in a single day. We must not tempt the Lord, that is, test his patience, question his purpose of why he says what he does, or exploit his goodness, thinking that somehow that God, doesn't really, allow it. He doesn't care what we do. We can do it as we please, as some of them did, and they were killed by serpents. And do not murmur, and the Amplified adds, in unwarranted discontent, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Remember, they murmured. They murmured, but God was giving them spiritual food, providing them with manna. They didn't even have to, all they had to do was go out and collect it. They didn't have to go to the grocery store and pay for it. All they had to do was go out and pick it up. And they provided them with water to drink in the desert. Good water, abundant water from the rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. And we shouldn't murmur as some of them did in unwarranted discontent. And they were destroyed by the destroyer, Paul says. You can read the accounts in the book of Numbers of what happened to these people. Now these things, verse 11, here's the Paul. Here's the sum. Paul is saying to the Corinthian brethren, to the Greeks who had come in and become part of the church of God, who had been baptized, who had their sins forgiven, and were walking now in newness of life. He said, verse 11, now these things, Christian Greek brethren, happen to them as examples and a warning to us. They were written for our instruction, to admonish and equip us, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Paul might have just as well have said to you and me, here in North America, the United States, or Canada, or any place else, wherever you might be receiving, might see this webcast. These things happened to them. They were an example. They were a warning. They were an admonishment. They were, as one version puts it, a prefigurative history of what's going to happen again. Just as has happened many times in the past, it will repeat itself, or rhyme, if you want to be specific. Some people say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Why do we say that? What do I base that on? What did Paul base that on? Well, it says very clearly in Hebrews 13:8, which I believe Paul wrote while he was a prisoner sitting in Caesarea, okay, after he'd been, taken away from a mob there at the temple. But anyways, in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, as he was in Mount Sinai, today, here it is, we're speaking today in the 21st century, and forever into the unseeable future, unto this point of the vanishing point of trying to understand the future and the reality. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So these things were written to admonish us, because the one we worship and we have to do with, he's the same. Okay, are we win? All right. I want to quote something here, just trolling around the web a little bit. The CBC originally posted this about a little over a year ago. It was just before our election here. Pity the poor pagans. Don't they have rights? And what about the Rastafarians? And to say nothing of the Satanists, such questions won't seem weird once the attention turns away from liberal MP Moral Berlanger's heroic bid to update the rusty words of the national anthem. That's because his bill leaves untouched some other words that concern. Can we talk about this? The CBC says, even the touchier subject, the Christian God. Oh, our national anthem here in Canada talks about the Christian God. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love and all thy sons command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Now, Canadians hear this anthem, repeatedly, and they will start here already, because they play it before they begin the hockey games. And even when they play down in the United States, our teams play down there, they still play it. And of course, we know the American anthem too, don't we? Of course we do. Recently, they had a problem when I think the PA system in one of the major Canadian cities, and it was a hockey game, and Americans were up here playing a Canadian team, and they couldn't play the Star Spangled Banner, but the Canadians all knew it, and they sang it anyways. You know that? And that's, which was really good. I wonder how many Americans could sing the Canadian national anthem. Anyways, it's very interesting. These national anthems, some of these national songs are under attack because countries are changing, turning their backs on God. Now, the Canadian Secular Alliance recognizes that the mention of God in our national anthem reflects Canada's Christian heritage and salutes the great historical contribution of Christian Canadians towards the building of our nation. That's right. Everyone who built this country, with very, very few exceptions, would have thought of themselves as a Christian. They did. However, the secular people say Canada's cultural and religious landscape has shifted significantly in modern times, and the national anthem should be updated to reflect this reality. A recent poll conducted by Harris Decima and just 9 years ago at this point, found that 23% of Canadians, that's 36% of Canadians under the age of 25, however, younger Canadians tend to be more secular than their elders, say that they do not believe in any God, except for themselves, of course. It doesn't say that, but they believe they are their own God. They really do. I do as I please type of thing. Further, the mention of God, the Canadian Secular Alliance says, the mention of God in an anthem is often cited as evidence that Canada is a quote-unquote, Christian nation. and used to argue for substantive public policies that undermine church-state separation. In other words, they were public policies that reflected the Judeo-Christian values found in the Bible. Boy, we're moving farther away from that all the time. You look at our social policies and the laws, they're contrary to what the Bible teaches. Contrary. Very serious areas. Thus, seemingly trivial issues of symbolism, like the mention of God in our national anthem, have a tendency to become relevant in highly non-trivial debates about government policy. Thus, Canada's current national anthem puts a sizable fraction of the population in a position where showing love for their country also entails invoking a deity whose existence they reject. Of course, those attitudes, I'm talking about Canadians and the stuff that we're here. And if you're an American and you're listening to this, you say, oh, well, we're better than that. Really? No, really not. According to the New York Times article, also from last year, 2016, just before your elections, recent elections, there was an article entitled, "Sick and Tired of God Bless America." The population of non-religious Americans, including atheists, agnostics, and anyone who calls themselves nothing in particular, stands at an all-time high in 2016. Americans who say religion is not important to their lives and who do not belong to any religious group, and that's even according to the research by the Pew Research Center, have risen in numbers. It's just in the last 8 years, from 21 million to more than 36 million. It's growing fast. Those who say they have no God in particular, nothing. At the same time, the columnist in the New York Daily News, Gersh Kuntzman, who's a sports writer, was objecting to the fact of singing God Bless America in baseball games, America's national pastime. He said, "It's time for God to stop blessing America. It's time for God to stop blessing America." Okay, I'll read on here, but just notice what he said. During the 7th inning stretch. Welcome to July 4th weekend, when once again baseball fans will be assaulted with a saccharine-sweetened non-anthem God Bless America in stadia all over this great land. The song, he says, should be permanently sent to the bench. All right. Okay, if God doesn't going to bless America, what will he do? We don't want God to bless America. We don't want God to bless America. We don't want to mention God in Canada. We don't want that. Okay, so nature abhors a vacuum. What are you going to get? What are you going to get? America was founded, just as in Canada. It was even the secularists admit it was founded by Christians, Canadian Christians. America was founded by men and women who believed when they came to the New World, that the communities that were establishing were in covenant with the Bible's God. And I want to quote from a book called The Hebrew Impact on Western Civilization. Unquote. The Puritans time and again drew on the idea that they had made a covenant with the Bible's God, and even worked the idea into the first major North American document, the first major North American pilgrim document, the Mayflower Compact. And they wrote this in the compact: "We whose names are underwritten have undertaken a voyage to plant ye first colony in ye northern parts of Virginia." Okay, they didn't have a clue where they were. They didn't know they were up in Massachusetts, or maybe that's Northern Virginia. They showed up after a long time and they were just grateful to be on solid ground. They didn't have an idea where, no GPS, had an idea where they were. "Do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in ye presence of God, and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic." The Puritans clearly felt that their church, the Puritan church, was in actuality a continuation of the covenant between God and the Hebrews, as the author writes. the Hebrew impact on Western civilization. This theme was hammered out from every pulpit for several hundred years. John Stevens, in a church in New Marlborough, Massachusetts, said, "The covenant of grace," listen to this. This is what he said. I wonder how many people would agree with this now in the Christian world here in North America. "The covenant of grace is the very same now as it was under the Mosaic dispensation. The administration differs, but the covenant is the same." You know, I'm sure the reason why Stevens said that and preached that several hundred years ago is because when he looked at what the new covenant promise is going to put the law in your hearts and your minds, and you know, it was having that same, you know, that's, you know, it was based on the same moral values. Then, like Israel of old, the pilgrims were able to regard themselves as the elect of God. They did. They regarded themselves as the elect of God, and throughout the Revolutionary War, even to the 1770s, they visualized themselves as fighting against their enemies, who to them, they saw them as Philistines or Amalekites. That's historic. That's what the people in this country thought. To the Puritans, the outstanding moral of the Old Testament was that a nation, as well as an individual, could be in covenant with God, and therefore a nation could be constrained by its own assent to obey the laws of God. Now I want to talk a little bit about what they were referring to. We're going to look a little bit at this. Yes, we don't want God to bless America anymore. What is the alternative? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 17. Let's look at what it says. Why were the Puritans thinking this? Why were the Pilgrims, when they wrote up the Mayflower Compact, what were they thinking of? All these things shaped the country when we began. It's true here in Canada, too. Deuteronomy 26 and verse 17. "Today you have openly declared the Lord to be your God." Okay, this is Moses reiterating to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. They're on the other side of the Jordan River, okay, on the east side, and they're getting ready to cross over, and they're going to have their fight with Jericho in a bit, but not yet. And Moses was reiterating what it was they were about, what the community, what the individual's responsibilities are. It says, "You've declared the Lord to be your God, that you will walk," that is to say, is the Amplified, because I'm quoting the Amplified, "live each and every day in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments, and his judgments, precepts, and listen to his voice. Today the Lord has declared you to be his people, his treasured possession, just as he promised you, and that you are to keep his commandments." Just as you have this idea, God bless America, this idea of American exceptionalism, even Canadian exceptionalism. Verse 19, "And that he will set you high above the nations which he has made for praise, fame, and honor, and that you shall be a holy people, set apart and consecrated to the Lord your God, just as he has spoken." Let's go down here in Deuteronomy 28. Let's move forward a couple pages in verse 9. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 9. I'm going to cite here the New Living Translation. "If you obey the commands of the Lord your God and walk in his ways," this is, you're practicing it, you're practicing these values, "the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he swore he would do. Then all the nations of the world will see you, that you are a people claimed by the Lord." See, the Lord claims you as his people, and they will stand in awe of you. "And the Lord will give you prosperity in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you, blessing you with many children, numerous livestock, and abundant crops." Verse 12, "The Lord will send rain at the proper time from his rich treasury in the heavens, and will bless the work you do." We surely, in the whole western part of this continent here, British Columbia and down the western states of the United States, we could have used that rain, and we didn't get it. We're getting some rain now, and I'm very grateful for it. Clear out the air and keep the whole place from burning down. And then it says, "You will lend to many nations, but you will never need to borrow from them." Oh, boy. The United States is the world's biggest debtor nation. It's borrowed from everybody and his brother. Canada is not far behind. Our current government is just increasing our debt like a drunken sailor. Verse 13, if you listen to these commands of the Lord your God that I'm giving you today, and if you carefully obey them, the Lord will make you the head and not the tail, and you will always be on top and never at the bottom. You must not turn away from any of the commandments I'm giving you, nor follow after other gods to worship them, or else. Okay, we don't want to sing God Bless America, or, oh, God, we stand on guard for thee. We don't want to say these things. What's the alternative? Verse 15, but if you refuse to listen to the Lord your God and do not obey all the commands and decrees I'm giving to you today, all these curses will come and overwhelm you, and he's going to list them. I'm not going to read them all right now. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 1. Isaiah 58 and verse 1. What is the responsibility of the church in this time? It says, Isaiah 58 and verse 1, cry aloud and do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet and declare to my people their transgression, and to the house of Jacob their sins. House of Jacob. They had, this is the patriarchs from Abraham, the father of our Christian faith. He had made a covenant with God. The Puritans understood that God made covenants with individuals as well as nations. And to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet, it says, verse 2, they seek me day by day and delight superficially to know my ways, as if they were in reality a nation that has done righteousness and has not abandoned, has not turned away from the ordinances of their God. There's one thing that characterizes Canada and the United States of America and our governing elite is that they want to look good without doing good. They are complete hypocrites. They want to look good, but they don't want to really do what's good. Let's go to Deuteronomy 29, verse 14. Deuteronomy 29 and verse 14. Now, this is a little point here I want to show. Who Moses was saying to the Israelites before they crossed over. He said to the Israelites, they were all standing there. They had, as kids, not their kids, but as kids, most of the adults, when Moses was speaking to them, had stood at the foot of Mount Sinai with their parents and had heard, God make his covenant with them. Speak the 10 Commandments. They had been there, at least the older ones. Maybe some of the youngest adults know, but the older ones had. So what about them? Deuteronomy 29 and verse 14. But you are not the only ones with whom I am making this covenant with its curses. Because if you don't keep the covenant, okay, there's blessings if you do and curses if you don't. I'm making this covenant both with you who stand here today in the presence of the Lord our God, and also with future generations who are not standing here. So it was going to be binding on their descendants. And if they didn't do what God said, there were going to be consequences. I was poking around the internet this week, preparing for a bit of a sermon. It was interesting, some biblical archaeological stuff. And this past year, they discovered in doing digging, I think it was to put in some sort of infrastructure, I think pipes or something. They discovered this area in Jerusalem which showed the destruction from the Babylonians, this destruction layer. All the black, you could see it. It's very clear in the pots from that time, the pottery, very distinctive. That's when it was from. Yeah, it was going to be binding, as the prophet Jeremiah would say. You could read through there. It was binding what they were saying here on this other side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, back in around 1400. It was going to be binding on those people living around 600 and in the early 500s. Jerusalem was destroyed 586. By the Babylonians. Verse 16. You remember how we lived in the land of Egypt and how we traveled through the lands of enemy nations as we left. Okay, the older adults would have known that. You have seen their detestable practices and their idols made of wood, stone, silver, and gold. Yeah, they saw it. I'm not making this covenant with you so that no one among you. I'm making this covenant with you so that no one among you, no man, woman, clan, or tribe will turn away from the Lord our God to worship these gods of the other nations, and so that no root among you that bears bitter and poisonous fruit will spring up. Paul would use this analogy later himself. Verse 19, those who hear the warnings of this curse should not congratulate themselves thinking, I'm safe, because I'm here among all these people who are doing, I can do my own thing. Well, yeah, they can go, as it were, to church, and I can do my own thing. I'm safe even though I am following the desires of my own stubborn heart. This would lead to utter ruin, Moses was telling them. The Lord will never pardon such people. Instead, his anger and jealousy will burn against them, and all the curses written in this book will come down on them, and the Lord will erase their names from under heaven. The Lord will separate them from the tribes of Israel to pour out on them the curses in the covenant recorded in the book of instruction. You would have, of course, an example that would follow later on about Achan's sin, where that exact thing happened. When the ancient, that God made the point. Let's go back here to Deuteronomy 28, verse 63. We know what the story was, of course. It was a prefigurative history. And we know that they had all these problems. And we know through the book of Judges, of course, it was just a generation, and they were already turning their backs on the God of the Bible and doing their own thing. Deuteronomy 28, verse 63, just as the Lord has found great pleasure in causing you to prosper and multiply, the Lord will find pleasure in destroying you. You will be torn from the land you are about to enter and occupy, for the Lord will scatter you among all the nations from one end to the other. Happened to ancient Israel. Happened to the tribes of Judah. Ancient Israel when the Assyrians came in. Tribe of Judah when the Babylonians came in. There among these nations you will find no peace or place to rest. And the Lord will cause your heart to tremble, your eyesight to fail, and your soul to despair. Your life will hang constantly in balance. You could ask some of the older Jews who living in the state of modern Israel what it was like when the state of Israel was found and they were kicked out of their homes. You could ask them what it was like. They had to leave all around the Middle East at that time. Verse 66, your life will constantly hang in the balance, and you will live night and day in fear, unsure if you will survive. In the morning you will say, if only it were night. In the evening you will say, if only it were morning. For you will be terrified by the awful horrors you see all around you. I'm sure all the people going through some of Harvey's stuff and through Irma's stuff said or saying the same thing. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 30 and verse 1. Is it just bad news? No. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 1. Anything that has to do with the Bible's God, there's always hope. There's always hope, even in desperate times. When all these things have happened to you, the blessings and the curses I have set before you. And I grew up with all the blessings. When the United States, their time in the United States and Canada were riding high and life was good. I've seen it. When all these things happen to you, the blessings and cursings have set before you, and you come to your senses, God says, while you are in all the nations where the Lord God has driven you. So there have been consequences. You've been exiled because you rebelled. And you and your children return to the Lord and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, doing everything I am giving you today. Then he will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if your exiles are at the end of the earth, he will gather you and bring you back from there. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land of your fathers possessed, and you will take possession of it. Specific promise, that is made here. The story of modern Israel is a remarkable story, and the revival of the Hebrew language never happened before in history. Or a nation that had disappeared for almost 1900 years to be reestablished as a sovereign nation on the face of the earth. Remarkable story. In my life, just before I was born. And he will cause you to prosper and multiply you more than he did to your fathers. And the Lord will circumcise your heart, he promises. Okay, this was a promise in the old covenant. Okay, from that, he'll circumcise your heart. The Amplified says, what does this mean? That is, he will remove the desire to sin from your heart. People turn away. They abandon God and have been abandoning God in the United States and Canada for the last 2 generations because they want to sin. They want to sin in their heart. They want to do their own thing. He will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants, and you will love him with all your heart and all your soul so that you will live. You know, despite the fact that the leaders of the Western world, our political, our social leaders, our media, for the most part, have turned their collective backs on the Bible and the Bible's God, the moral logic of the universe remains valid. It's active. It continues to produce blessings or curses according to the individuals and even whole nations and their attitudes towards him. The author, Matthew Arnold, who's a classicist, once said, "To the Bible men will return." And why? Because they cannot do without it. Because happiness is our being's desire and aim. And happiness belongs to the righteousness. And righteousness is revealed in the Bible. Oh. See, there's something that people seek and need. They just can't get from the secular society. Let's go to Psalm 119. Psalm 119 verse 169, New Living Translation. Psalmist is saying, "O Lord, listen to my cry." Okay, when I'm in trouble and I'm praying, Hurricane Irma is coming down on me, or I'm having this problem or that problem, or I'm getting ready to get burnt out. Lord, listen to my cry. Give me the discerning mind you promised so I can know what's right from wrong. Listen to my prayer. Rescue me as you promised. Because God does love his people, and he does intervene on behalf of his people. Let praise flow from my lips, for you have taught me your decrees. Verse 172, let my tongue sing praise for the fulfillment of your word, for all your commands are righteous. God's commands are, the definition, are righteous. Psalm 119, verse 172. That's what righteousness is. Self-righteousness is people who set up themselves and their standard of what they think is righteous as opposed to God's standard. Most of the people in our political elite running our societies these days, they're self-righteous. They're setting up what they want to do. It's not God's righteousness. But they want to look good, but they don't want to do good. Not good according to what God says. Righteousness is strong, 66-64, Sadiq. What is right? What is just? What is normal? You know, there is natural law. Rightness, justice, justness of weights, measures, doing things. Right paths and living is the way, this is the lexicon Brown, Driver, and Briggs puts it. Righteousness, as they say, is lexicon. It's an innate part of just who God is. Righteousness describes God's loving loyalty in keeping up his end of the covenant, providing the means as well for forgiveness and redemption. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 62. Let's go to one of the prophets, the prophet Isaiah chapter 62, verse 1. Isaiah was one of the major prophets who prophesied to King Hezekiah during the time when the Assyrians were invading Judah. They'd already successfully wiped out the northern rebellious 10 tribes of Israel, okay, and now they were trying to do the same thing in the south. They took all of Judah except for Jerusalem, because King Hezekiah turned to God for his help. By the way, it was just 2 years ago that we actually found in Jerusalem, in the administrative center, Hezekiah's personal seal. Oh, he was a real person. Oh yeah, that's a long time ago, 2,700 years ago. Yeah, Bible talks about him. Yeah, he was there. Isaiah 62, verse 1, New Living Translation. Because I love Zion, prophet Isaiah saying, I will not keep still. Because my heart yearns for Jerusalem, I cannot remain silent. I will not stop praying for her until her righteousness shines like the dawn, and her salvation blazes like a burning torch. The nations will see your righteousness. This is God's people, his chosen people, his treasured people. World leaders will be blinded by your glory. This is a prophecy. And you will be given a new name by the Lord's own mouth. We will be called something else. I don't think we're going to be called Christians after the return of Jesus Christ. We're going to be called something else because the word has lost really the context and its significance of its meaning that it used to have. The Lord will hold you in his hand. Okay, world leaders will be blinded by your in Revelation 5, it says very clearly that we're going to be kings and priests of God. We're going to reign with Jesus Christ. He says we will share as we're his throne. That's what he promises his saints, who are, become spiritual beings in the new covenant, who are resurrected. Canadians and Americans need to remember what the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10. Remember what he said. 1 Corinthians 10. Apostle Paul said this. Now these things, the things written in Deuteronomy, the things written in Numbers and Leviticus and Exodus and Genesis, all those things happened to them, happened to the fathers, who it doesn't matter whether you were born a Jew or whether you were born an Arab or whether you were born a Chinese or Japanese or Vietnam or wherever you were born. It's irrelevant if you become a Christian. It happened for us, for our example and warning. They are written for our instruction, to admonish us, to equip us, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. All these things, this whole story, this relationship with God that ancient Israel lived with the blessings and the cursings, blessings when they were doing what they ought to have been, and cursings when they refused and turned their back stubbornly. They're written for our instruction, that we might profit from it. And God, Hebrews 13, verse 5, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What he did back then with them, he is doing right now in to the people of the United States of America and Canada and wherever else and every place else he's operating in this world. And this is, he's the ultimate judge of this world. In the church, in the Christian church, too often this has been forgotten. We have to remember that we have even a higher level, because our hearts should be circumcised. We should be willing to do what God asks us to do his will, rather than to want to do our own thing and to sin. Let's go to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. Apostle Peter said this to all the brethren. And he was writing to brethren who were not of Jewish ethnic origin. He was saying in 1 Peter 2 and verse 1, New Living Translation, so get rid of all evil behavior. Get rid of it. Bible tells us what's right. Bible tells us what's wrong. Be done with all deceit, hypocrisy, jealousy, and all unkind speech. Like newborn babies, you must crave pure spiritual milk so that you will grow into a full experience of salvation, to maturity, spiritual maturity. I mean, we're supposed to grow into the stature of Jesus Christ himself. That's That's our goal. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Cry out for this nourishment. Verse 3. Now that you have had a taste of the Lord's kindness, I have. If you become a Christian, you know, because you've seen how the Lord works in your life, don't you? I have. Verse 4. You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. Christ is a stumbling block to the rulers of our age. We'll see this. Verse 5. And you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. Okay, making this analogy, talking about God's temple at Jerusalem. I've seen they were magnificent. They were enormous stones. Took a lot of weight. What's more, you are his holy priests. Through the mediation of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ mediates a new covenant between us and the Father. Moses mediated the old covenant between the Hebrews and Jesus Christ, or the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, the YHVH, the I am of the old covenant. What's more, you are his holy priests. Through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. As the scriptures say, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, chosen for great honor, and anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Those who don't trust in him will be disgraced. Think about that. Yes, you who trust in him recognize the honor God has given him. For those who reject him, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The world that the Bible speaks of that is coming, he is the cornerstone. It is not going to be secularism. It is not going to be all these things that are the antithesis of the morals and ethics that are taught by the Bible. The stone that the builders rejected, and they've rejected him in our society. 21st century, 2017, the politicians, the political leaders, the elite that are ruling media, social, whatever, are ruling Canada and the United States have rejected Jesus Christ, has become the cornerstone. Verse 8, and he is the stone that makes people stumble, the rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they do not obey God's words so that they may meet the fate that is planned for them. That was planned for them. Verse 9, but you're not like that, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, okay, what is your mission? Okay, if you should be so willing to accept it, sounds like Mission Impossible, okay? If you're so willing to accept this mission, quote-unquote, impossible, as a result, because you are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession, you can show others the goodness of God. For he has called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Once you had no identity as a people, now you are God's people. Once you had received no mercy, now you have received God's mercy. Those who receive God's mercy are still the Lord's treasured people. And he will bless them, because the Lord knows how to save the godly out of trial and tribulation. Trust in him. Taste and see. The Lord is good. Let's pray.